Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Stony Brook, Southampton for the second debate presented by the Southampton Progressive Caucus. I hope everyone had time beforehand to speak with the individual groups outside that make up the Southampton Progressive Caucus and represent the vital grassroots uprising that's happening right here in our district. As the founder of the East End Action Network, I can tell you that the past year and a half has been baptism by fire, but joining the Southampton Progressive Caucus and not just working with activist groups, but actually alongside the Southampton Town Democrats, has provided invaluable guidance and insight, and perhaps more importantly, proof that when we all work together, we are greater than the sum of our parts. So thank you for that. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, you're late. No, just kidding. We had a debate before this, and I encourage you all to find it on YouTube. If you just do a simple search of Southampton Progressive Caucus at youtube.com, that comes right up for you. So now, for the task at hand, please allow me to introduce to you the 5 candidates returning for today's debate who will be on the ballot in June's Democratic primary. We have Kate Browning. Kate served as Suffolk County legislator representing the 3rd District for 12 years, and before taking office, she worked as a school bus driver in the William Floyd School District. We have Elaine DiMasi, who spent 21 years as a federal contractor and project manager at Brookhaven National Lab before announcing her candidacy. Perry Gershon. Perry is a successful businessman who, after founding a sports bar at the age of 23, then spent more than 25 years in commercial real estate finance. We have David Pechefsky. David is the valedictorian of his graduating class at Patchogue Medford High School. And he's currently on leave from his position as senior advisor with Generation Citizen. That's a nonprofit that trains college students to be Democratic coaches and provides civic education for middle and high school students. And finally, these are in alphabetical order, Vivian Viloria Fisher. Vivian spent 13 years as Suffolk County legislator in East Setauket. Before taking office, she was a teacher for the Middle Country and 3 Village School District. So please welcome them all to the stage today. We know your schedules have been taxing leading up to this primary, so thank you for making the time for us. Okay, very quickly, we've made a few changes since the last debate, so I want to go over the format. The questions prepared for today's debate were a collaborative effort between Southampton Progressive Caucus members, and they have not been shown to the candidates. And this is how it's going to work. We have 2 minutes allotted for each candidate to answer each question. After a minute and a half has passed, they will receive a warning from our timekeepers, who are right up here, that they have 30 seconds remaining. Once their 2 minutes are up, they will be permitted to finish their sentence before being asked to stop speaking. In true debate form, each candidate has been given 3 blue cards, and after every candidate has answered the initial question, they are then at liberty to use one of those cards to challenge another candidate. Whoever they challenge will have a minute to rebut. As for the audience, we ask that you please hold your applause to the end of the debate to maximize debate time. And with that, Kate, you drew the lucky straw this time, so we'll start with you. You ready? Sure. Okay, let's jump right in. What do you believe are the ramifications of President Trump withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran?
Oh, wow. Well, should I stand up, or are you going to hear me if I? Okay. So, a number of things. You know, he's talking about going to Korea. First of all, bad idea. The great negotiator walked away. He took his ball and went home rather than negotiating. And I think that puts us in more danger, not pulling away from the deal. Talking about sanctions with our allies also is a really bad idea, because now you're fracturing relationships with our allies. We need our allies to continue to work towards stabilization throughout the world. Right now, like what's going on is obviously Germany and England and Japan, and you know they are all still in the agreement. But what might happen is if Iran walks away completely, what could potentially happen is we could wind up in another war. And you know, I know many of you have heard from me. I have 2 sons in the Air Force. I don't want to see my kids go to war. And we look at our gas prices. Look at our gas prices right now. Why is that happening? Is because Iran is no longer in we're no longer in the deal with Iran. And I can't imagine how much worse it could get, because there's billions of barrels of oil that we're losing every day that we are not being able to keep our prices down. And so what is he doing? He's going to shift his allegiances to Saudi Arabia, not a democratic country, not a democratic country. And there are serious human rights violations that are going on there every day. So this is something that I'm very concerned about. He should have stayed at the table to negotiate. And now he wants to talk about, a nuclear deal with North Korea. Why would North Korea want to negotiate anything with the United States and with Donald Trump? Because the bottom line, because there is no trust there anymore.
Thank you, Kate. Perry.
Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. What do you believe are the ramifications of President Trump withdrawing from the nuclear deal with Iran?
Okay, thank you. People hear me okay? Okay, so Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, and he made noises he was going to do this during the election and for the first year of his presidency. And the rationale for doing it was he didn't like the deal. He thought we could do better. What does that mean? It means that, as Kate said, we've said to the whole world that the U.S.'s word in a deal is no longer valid. It hurts the United States' credibility. It also says to the Europeans who did want to stay in the deal, they're now stuck. They can either pull out of the deal too, or they will be subject to American sanctions. So the betting is that the Europeans, if the U.S. presses them, are going to have to pull out of the deal too. And that's going to isolate Iran. And Iran will then say, do we want to go back to building our nuclear program? And the chances there are, yes, they will. And that was the quid pro quo of the deal. There were problems with the deal at first, and many of us knew that. It wasn't perfect. It did not cover all weapons. It only covered nuclear. It didn't cover ballistic missiles in particular. There were other problems in that it had a sunset provision, meaning that the Iranians were prohibited from developing nuclear for a certain period of time. But at the end of the sunset, they could start building again. But all of that is better to have them not building than building nuclear weapons. And as Kate said, the other ramifications that we have, gas prices are going up because there are questions about the supply of oil in the future. And we haven't really seen it yet because the rest of the world is still buying Iranian oil. If they stop, gas prices are really going to go up because oil supply will go down. And then there are questions on war going forward.
Thank you.
I'd like to see the people in the back, so I'll stand up. This whole issue of pulling out of the Iran deal is emblematic of the type of presidency that is being carried on by Mr. Trump. He's transactional. He doesn't go any farther than looking at the deal that he thinks is right before him. So he pulled out of the Iran deal without thinking of the ramifications, which is a break with our allies, our European allies, with a position, as has been noted already by my colleagues, of mistrust, of putting the United States in the position of not being trusted by the rest of the world. Do you remember when Trump said, I didn't think that healthcare would be so hard? Well, he didn't think that diplomacy would be so hard. He didn't think that trade would be so hard. But nothing is simply sitting at a table and making a deal at the end of at the last moment. You know, Pompeo had announced a couple of days before Trump decided to pull out that we weren't ready yet. Okay, his advisors had pushed him to give it a little more time, but he's impulsive. And this impulsive behavior is costing us not only the mistrust of our allies, but the mistrust of those with whom we have to now deal, such as North Korea. Speaking of advisors, what did Bolton bring out with regards to the Iran deal, and perhaps discussing with Korea denuclearization? Libya, bad example. And when Trump tried to walk that back. What happened? He made matters worse by saying that we would be protectionist toward North Korea. So what happens when you have a president who doesn't have a worldview, who doesn't listen to his advisors? We have a chaotic White House. We have an impulsive president.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would say there are two important ramifications of Trump pulling out of the Iran deal. Plus, as a third bonus, we get to learn how little Lee Zeldin understands about nuclear technology, based on what he's been publishing. I'm a physicist. I've been in the National Laboratory for 21 years, and some of my colleagues in national security were the people who looked at the details of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and who traveled to North Korea to be part of inspections there as well. So with the United States pulling out of that deal, we just weakened the deal. It was called a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action because it was crafted by our European allies and Russia and China to reduce Iran's nuclear breakout time. And to attack it on basis that there was a sunset provision or that it didn't cover conventional weapons or that it didn't do these other things, it was a job done to do a specific task, which was to expand, I'm sorry, I think I said reduce, expand Iran's nuclear breakout time and make it harder, make them more accountable in terms of denuclearizing the militaries of all the worlds. And so it increases, we're basically giving a share of our influence to Russia and even to Turkey, who agrees with their opponent Russia that we should stay in the Iran deal. So it takes away our credibility. Blaming Trump feels good, but Republicans during the Obama administration were resentful because Obama did not ratify that deal as a treaty. It was done as an executive order, and they have been wanting to be critical of that since it passed. So Congress has no legal recourse, but we can speak out strongly against handing our influence away.
Thank you, Elaine.
Okay, now, all right, everyone can hear me? Rebecca, thanks for your introduction. There was a gap there in my resume from graduating high school to my current work. So in between, one of the things I've done is I've worked for a National Democratic Institute in many countries throughout the world, working to build democratic institutions. And this is, some of it was funded by the US government, some by other governments. So I've worked in Somalia and Liberia and other places, and that's the lens through that work is one of the things that shapes how I view foreign policy. And so for me, this question about leaving the Iran deal, I think, like many other issues, I mean, we can talk about the ramifications, but we have to take a step back and say, what's in our national interest? What's truly in our national interest in terms of how we conduct ourselves in the world and towards other countries? And it seems clear to me that what Trump and people like Pompeo and Bolton, I mean, they view it in their national interest to go to war. They view it as in our national interest to try to impose our will through military force. And the question is that truly in our national interest? And so the Iran deal was a small step sort of in the favor of diplomacy in the middle of a long record of the U.S. of trying to impose itself on other countries violently with disastrous results, which have not been in our national interest. They have not been in the interests of the majority of Americans. We have crumbling infrastructure, poor healthcare, poor education. So we have to turn back to the tide on that and focus on diplomacy if we're gonna improve our politics and improve our country.
Thank you, David. We have our first card that we're going to use. Elaine, is it directed towards anybody?
It is. I'm unclear on why Kate referenced Middle Eastern oil. It's my understanding that the energy economy has been adjusted so that we're no longer dependent on Middle East oil, and we have enough from South America and other sources.
I just think that, we're looking at our gas prices, and I would never assume Donald Trump and his relationship with the Saudis would not encourage him to now start working with them. to bring more oil to reduce our prices. So I could be wrong on that, but I certainly, every option should be, or consideration should be looked at.
Okay, Perry, you'll have a minute.
All right, so 2 quick points. In terms of why it has an effect on gas prices, just taking Middle Eastern oil out of the worldwide oil supply is going to drive prices up. Whether the U.S. gets its oil from doesn't matter where the U.S. gets its oil from. It's an overall global oil supply. The second point is in terms of repercussions, the one thing left out is that Netanyahu is really pushed Trump to pull out of the Iran deal. And the reason he did that is likely that he wants to destabilize the Iranian government. He's looking for regime change. He doesn't make a secret of it. He wants the government of Iran to fall. And obviously the problem with that for us is we don't know what the next government is going to be like. And that's really why it's so dangerous that we pulled out. Thanks.
Thank you. So for our next question, Perry, you're going to start, so you could keep that mic. The question is, what impact has the movement of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem had and will have on the United States' role in the Middle East?
So, just first and foremost, I'm not a proponent of moving the embassy when we did. Congress said we should move the embassy. It's the right thing to do, and it is the right thing to do when the time is right, and the time is not right now. The imagery that we saw on Monday of Zeldin and the Trump family and Pastor Jeffress celebrating the moving the embassy and the rioting and that was going on in Gaza and people being killed at the border was really disgusting, and it's a scene that looks terrible for America. Going forward, the U.S. lost its credibility as a broker of peace. It's going to make it harder to achieve a two-state solution. The reason I wasn't for moving the embassy right now is because I am for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Arab and Israeli-Palestine issue. We need a two-state solution for Israel to remain both Jewish and democratic. And even most Israelis are for a two-state solution. The question is timing. And the time may not be right now because there is no partner on the Palestinian side. But the time is also not right to move the embassy. Why wave a red flag in front of a bull, which is what we did? And from the U.S.'s point of view, as I said, we lose our credibility both as a broker but also as an advocate for human rights and for humanity. Because what's happening in Gaza is problematic, and bringing it to the world stage isn't good. And like my answer to the last question, this is another example of Trump really following Netanyahu's policy blindly and not putting the thought of American interests long-term into it as he should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Perry. Vivian.
Certainly, most of you have heard commentators on the radio and on TV and in newspapers referring to the fact that many other presidents had said that they would move the embassy. But they did not. Because they had the foresight to know that you don't use that ace. You don't throw away your most important chip when you're going into bargaining. And for Donald Trump, who calls himself the great negotiator, the art of the deal, he didn't have this chip that would have helped him in a bargaining situation if he were to be a broker of peace. And that's what held the other presidents from making this move. That's what held them back. If you really believe in a two-state solution, if you really believe in a peaceful solution, then you need to have something with which to bargain. The second issue with it is that we knew that it was incendiary. As far as Perry just said, it's like waving that red flag in front of a bull. We saw the repercussions immediately. We saw the protesters and then the mowing down of 60 of them. And when the UN had a resolution to have an investigation into what occurred at the border, the United States voted against it. We voted against investigating a critical situation. We voted against seeking the truth. And who voted with us? Honduras and Guatemala. What had they been promised? So we waved that flag inciting violence. We saw the violence between Iran and Israel. Thank you.
I would not have moved the embassy to Jerusalem in that manner. Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security, and they have the right, actually, not even to be spoken of as game pieces on a board for negotiators to play with. A negotiated two-state solution is required in order to override the terrorism of Hamas and make it irrelevant and unify against it and allow peace in the region. Jerusalem is a city of multiple faiths. It is a holy site for multiple faiths, and without a negotiated settlement of peaceful borders, there is no way to have the capital of Israel be negotiated as Jerusalem. And for us to move our embassy to Jerusalem is to play a unilateral, again, using that metaphor, play a card in favor of that outcome, which is not the business unilaterally of the United States to make. So what we've learned from this is that Trump appears to listen to other world leaders who appear not to be urgently demanding peace. And it's up to us in Congress to vote for peace and to understand that a diplomatic solution is urgently needed there, and we cannot be doing unilateral gestures of that sort. You know, Israel to me is a place of leadership and democracy in the Middle East. It is a place where desalination technology exceeds, they have a capacity that exceeds the amount of fresh water that is needed for that state. So if water can be a bridge in the desert instead of a point of bitter conflict, everything else can too. And Tel Aviv is a city that has had a pride march for 20 years or more. This all has to come together without the likes of Trump.
Rebecca, just a point of clarification. If we want to ask a question, we do it after everyone's answered, or can we jump in? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. After everyone. All right. So on this issue, the question is how to achieve peace in the Middle East, how to achieve peace between, in specifically in that area, in Israel, Palestine, and clearly what Trump decided to do is only inflaming things and making it worse. It doesn't bring us any closer. It doesn't for Israel to live in peace and security in the region with its neighbors. It also 5 million Palestinians remain stateless people without the rights of being citizens, and the situation in Gaza, it's a humanitarian crisis, which yes, bad actors like Hamas seek to exploit. But the fact remains, you have over 1 million people there, and they're not the rights of citizens in a dire humanitarian crisis. And until that's addressed, there's a underlying problem that's going to keep on reoccurring. So this is a disastrous thing to do. It's something that he did to appeal to certain domestic constituencies. And to curry favor with them, it represents bad policy and the opposite of what we need to be doing if we're going to try to play a constructive role in the region.
Thank you, David. Kate.
Okay. Well, again, this is a man who tweeted, "This is a great day in Israel and a great day in Jerusalem." And in the meantime, I think most of you saw those pictures where they were split shots of young people who were being killed on the streets. Again, someone who grew up in a war zone, this is something that I, having grown up in a war zone and experiencing what it feels like every day of your life, This is not something that should be continuing to go on, and a peace agreement is so important, and I too agree with that, the two-state peace agreement. Everyone has a right to a homeland, and everyone has a right to peace. And what Trump has done, he's destabilized that entire area by moving. This is not the right time to do it. The one thing that I see is, in the past, the Palestinians have talked about East Jerusalem and wanting East Jerusalem to be their capital city. And we're not there yet. And I don't think that the United States does have a right to push any issue. And like Perry said, Netanyahu is just pushing Trump to continue to do these things, which causes more problems, and it will help Hamas and ISIS to grow stronger because of what Donald Trump is doing. So we need right now to say, no, it should not have happened. I know it's happened. And what may happen down the road, and what is going to occur in the future because of this move. And again, I'm also concerned about the safety of the U.S. citizens who are now working there. What kind of jeopardy and danger has this president put them in by moving the embassy to Jerusalem?
Thank you. David, would you like to use one of your cards? Okay. So our next question, one's just heavier after the other. It's quite the timing for this debate. So what would you consider a successful outcome of the June summit with North Korea, assuming it happens? And what are the shortcomings of the Trump administration's approach to the North Korean challenge?
Can I have an hour?
And yes, Vivian, you start.
Well, after all the posturing and rocket boy and fire and brimstone from Trump, we reach a point where we're talking about a June 12th summit with President Kim. I don't really think it's going to happen, and if it does, I can't imagine that the promise of denuclearization is going to happen. And why is that? Let's go back and see some of the dancing that was done here. We had, because we can't exclude China's role as well, we had the president state that there was going to be a summit between the United States and North Korea. And immediately following that, there was a meeting in Singapore with China and North Korea, because China doesn't want to be left out of these negotiations. China has a place in this, which, by the way, is a vacuum that was left by this administration when we walked out of TPP without looking for a plan B, which is what has happened with the walking out of the Iran deal without looking or considering a plan B. Now, we're walking into the summit if it occurs, because don't forget that Mr. Kim was angry at something else that Mr. Bolton said, and said he may not be showing up to the summit. Denuclearization is not going to happen. The United States is not going to become the protector of North Korea, as Mr. Trump suggested. So the best that can happen is to work on commerce, on trade, and be willing to have sanctions for the humanitarian problems going on in North Korea.
And then your question was, what is the outcome we could hope for or wish for from an upcoming putative summit?
Yes.
Okay. Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un has outsmarted far better presidents than President Trump. Twice Americans inspectors have gone to to the DPRK, to North Korea, to go to the fuel rod pool and stabilize and canify materials that subsequently the North Koreans began reprocessing again. And North Korea has not only its nuclear facilities, but all of its military facilities in large underground networks, because that is where they went, faced with the wars around them from previously. So it has always been difficult to impossible for international inspectors to get access to the DPRK. And only when China is in the picture as a strong negotiator has there been a stability towards North Korea slowing down and not speeding up its activities. And the fact is, about sanctions, the North Koreans are willing to endure poverty like we would not countenance. And again, my national security colleagues have shown me the photographs that they were allowed to show me from North Korea, and how it's a 4-mile walk for people from the city where the ambassadors are to walk down the dirt road to get to their day's work, which is to sweep with a push broom that section of the dirt road and then walk 4 miles home again. So we need to regain America's strength, which comes from our economic capabilities and our international relationships. And with one bridge being burned after another, we don't have a relationship with China. We don't have a relationship with the EU that we need to have. We won't have leverage. The best outcome would be one in which we get some of that, a stronger partnership somehow with China would be the best outcome I could hope for.
Thank you, Elaine. David, when you're ready.
Like many of these issues, the problem is our lack of ability to correctly understand what's motivating the other side, so to speak. And it is my own experience in working with foreign leaders which have included the current Prime Minister of Iraq, who's on his way out, apparently, although he may hang on. But anyway, the issue is that, so, you know, the question, so what motivates their behavior? What motivates the behavior of foreign leaders, and how do you assess that? And we get it wrong over and over and over again. And so in this case, in some, you know, so the hope of what can come of it, I mean, it's unclear. I mean, in principle, meeting is a good idea, sitting down and trying to find a negotiation. But again, it's a question of how you define our national interest and what we truly need to be doing in that region. Do we need to have the kind of military presence that we do and have this, you know, vast empire of bases and expenditures and you know, frankly, in North Korea's case, I mean, in many countries, right, it's very rational that they want to have nuclear weapons because we have a history of invading other countries and trying to achieve regime change. And so countries look at that, like Iran, and they say, how can we prevent this from happening to us? Like Libya, for example. So, you know, what I would say, yes, I mean, negotiations are good, but it's going to require a regional settlement, and that's also the case in the Middle East. It's going to require a regional settlement and bringing in people that we don't necessarily like to work with, and finding a path to where we cannot have a path that leads to violence and war.
Thank you, David. Kate, would you like me to repeat the question?
That might be a good idea.
Okay. What would you consider a successful outcome of the June summit with North Korea? And what are the shortcomings of the Trump administration's approach to the North Korean challenge?
Okay. Well, we all know North Korea is a global threat to our security. And I can only be hopeful that those negotiations could occur. However, after Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, what faith does anyone have? What faith would North Korea have? You know, one of the things I question too is North Korea, we have no idea what they're going to be asking for, what they're going to be requiring in this deal. And so, you know, I'd say I would be very cautious because we are not aware of what they're looking for. And I think that what would be most important is that we have to work with our partners, international partners, to ensure that we bring about pressure if those negotiations occur. Again, I'm hopeful. I'm not so sure it may happen. But we do need our international partners to work with us to put pressure on North Korea to come up with some kind of an agreement. But again, let's see what happens. It's just a matter of time. I know North Korea is not looking like they're very interested in coming to the table with us anymore, but we can only hope for the best.
So let me point out to start that we're talking about a summit that's going to happen in 2 to 3 weeks before our primary. So this is really soon, and if something real is going to come out of it, they better be pretty far along. So let's first say, why did we get to where we are? Why did North Korea and Trump come to want to talk to one another? From the North Korean point of view, there have been worldwide sanctions against them, which have been increasing. And there's a logical procession that would think that if the sanctions make things tough enough for Kim Jong-un, he will want to negotiate with the U.S. to get the sanctions relieved and might agree to disarmament or denuclearization. But from Trump's point of view, Trump started by calling him Rocket Man and raising the stakes for everybody. And then Trump has lots of stuff going on with his administration, and he has his Michael Cohen affair. He's got the questions over Stormy Daniels. And all of a sudden one day, Trump, while the Stormy Daniels story was the #1 headline, Trump said, I'm going to meet with Kim Jong-un. And Trump changed the media story, at least a little bit, and got people's attention off the domestic side. And he's now staking his presidency on his ability to form a deal with Kim Jong-un. That's what scares me, because we don't know that he's going to make a good deal. Trump's interest may be so much to make a deal that he could give up the kitchen sink. We don't know that, and what he's asking for is something that's awful hard to verify. So he could have a deal, celebrate. Lee Zeldin will say Trump should get the Nobel Prize. But 6 months from now, we may have nothing. That's my biggest fear.
Thank you, Perry. Elaine, you showed me a card. Is it directed towards anybody?
I just maybe misunderstood Vivian because she referenced China and the TPP, and since China was not a member of the TPP, I may have misunderstood what you were trying to say.
Actually, walking away from the TPP, not negotiating with the nations, with the Pacific nations, left a vacuum for China to step in and have its own trade deals with that part of the world. China has enormous economic influence globally, and leaving that kind of vacuum in the Pacific with the Pacific nations increased China's footprint globally.
Okay, moving on to the next question. What are the effects to Long Islanders regarding the current administration's climate policy, especially with the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords? And Elaine, yes, we'll start with you.
Luck of the draw, we asked the scientists to go first on climate change. In terms of practical outcomes, I believe the rest of the world that is in the Paris Accord will continue to try to achieve those goals. The Paris Accord was not binding on nations for achieving any goals. It simply was an indication of our intent, an indication of our understanding of how important it is. And fortunately, most of the United States and many, many, many leaders in the United States do understand how vital it is. Our own military understands how vital it is. This will be important to discuss with the independent and conservative-leaning base that we talk to during our upcoming campaign, because the military requested significant funds for moving their bases away from the coasts to escape the sea level rise. What the cost is, truly is at that level, above that level, we lose our strength when we do not have economic capabilities and when we lose our relationships. If we can't figure out how to continue to be allies with England and Germany and France, we are not going to solve any of the more difficult diplomatic problems facing the world. And we're weak. Angela Merkel, who's the Chancellor of Germany, said that Russia and the United States, we can deal with them, but we can't trust them. We have been put into the same category as Russia by Germany. that is an emergency. That is an emergency. And so climate change, unfortunately, is an equally urgent emergency. I look to states for leadership, and I look to the rest of the world for leadership until we can get back into that game. It was a very expensive political accord to withdraw from.
Thank you. David?
The United States needs to lead the fight against climate change instead of giving up our role of leadership. So what's happening is that we're falling increasingly behind. The biggest solar field is now in Mexico. And India and China are also investing in solar. So the consequences for us are disastrous, right? We'll continue our decline into a country that is a country that is isolated from its allies, but is also a country that increasingly is a place that not only is contributing to the global climate crisis, but also here at home the conditions at home will continue to get worse. If we don't address climate change, we're all the economic consequences of that, and the strain on our political and social system are only going to grow. I mean, we've seen it repeatedly with storms, and that's so the consequences are very grave, and we must try to reclaim our role as leaders, despite the current administration. But people have said, I think correctly, that climate change really is a national security issue. The Syrian war started for many reasons, not the least of which was our disastrous intervention in Iraq. But there's also strong evidence that drought led to exacerbate the situation and was a trigger to that civil war. And that you can see that kind of pressure across the globe in regions, particularly in Africa is the place that I've worked a lot in, and you see that. You see the impacts of climate change and how that's exacerbating social and political tensions, and we are in the same boat. We are facing the same situation. I think you can trace that line between environmental devastation and economic and political devastation.
Thank you, David. Kate?
Okay, pulling out of the Paris Accord, like I said earlier with the Iran deal, the great negotiator left, took his ball like a bad child, and didn't want to sit down at the table and say, let's renegotiate what we don't like. So he will not be the great negotiator. We can call him the great polluter, because that's what he is going to do. We have a responsibility nationally, we have a responsibility to our world to keep our communities clean. We need clean water, we need clean air. That's what keeps us alive. And so for this man to walk away and not want to negotiate, he's done nothing but cause problems. But let's look at what he's just doing here. He's rolling back all the environmental regulations that were created here in the United States. And we look at what's going on in Virginia. We look at what's going on here, where he wants to put up oil wells. This is a man that we need, again, to change the House so we can prevent him from continuing to do what he does. Because right now, he has the likes of Zeldin, who does not speak up, does not stand up. Lee Zeldin comes out here and he tells us how he's so good on the environment and he cares about our environment, but he never speaks up and he never defends our communities. He defends Trump, and he supports everything that he's done. He's supporting everything that he's rolled back. He agrees with them pulling out of the Paris Accord. So we need people in Congress who will tell him what he needs to do, because clearly he's not doing the right thing. So let's get back to the Paris Accord. Let's do what we need to do, and let's renegotiate, not walk away like a bad child.
Thank you. I'll reread the question. What are the effects to Long Islanders regarding the current administration's climate policy, especially with the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords? Perry.
So in terms of how we're affected in Long Island, We can see short-term effects, and then we can project long-term effects. In terms of the short term, we look at global warming and look at the rising shoreline, what it's doing in Montauk. I was in Fire Island today, what it's doing in Fire Island. It's global warming is a real issue on Long Island, and it's causing severe climate change. The storms that we felt in the last year, and Puerto Rico still hasn't dug out of it. And we need to take steps to do something about climate change and global warming, and that is why the Paris Accords were there and a good thing, and why it's so bad that we pulled out. What it's letting Trump do is pursue a policy of getting rid of the EPA standards. Scott Pruitt is really decimating the environment every way he can. Trump wants to remove the mileage requirements on cars to let them burn more oil. He's going further than the auto companies want him to. That, again, is pollution. He's Mr. Pollute, Donald Trump. But what does that mean for the long term, for Long Island in particular? Clean energy is supposed to be a future industry for us in Long Island. We want to build solar panels. We want to build wind farms. And we have the opportunity to potentially build them here to improve our manufacturing base and to do lots of research at Stony Brook. Stony Brook is the #1 driver of the Suffolk County, #1 employer in Suffolk County. So doing research into clean energy, which really comes out of the Paris Accord, is going to help drive our economy. So that's where we really lose in the long term.
Thank you.
The United States ceded its position of leadership when Ronald Reagan took the solar panels off the White House, when George Bush decided not to be part of the Kyoto talks. At that time, 1999, I was a new legislator, and I wanted to do something about climate change, and I did a lot of research. And I read about Denmark, little Denmark, that had 12% of its energy from sustainable resources. I just attended a NYSERDA hearing about windmills here off the coast of Long Island. We cannot continue to fall behind the rest of the world in climate change solutions. And, you know, you can see more and more homes on stilts across Long Island. We are an island. We are ground zero for being hit with climate change. We have a fishing industry that's very important here. We've lost our lobster industry. Why? Because the waters are too warm here for the lobsters to reach maturity, for the hens to reach that level of maturity to have baby lobsters. We have to talk about coal mining. Our air depends on the fuels that are being burnt to the west of us, because the air currents are bringing all of that pollution over us, over our atmosphere, and so we're breathing it. And that's how that affects Long Island. So the change in the water temperature is affecting our shellfish. The air quality is being affected by the coal mines that he's pushing, and by the, as Perry had mentioned, the lowering of the standards in automobiles. And certainly we're drowning from the tides.
Thank you. David, I know you would like to use one of your cards.
Yeah, thank you. So just following up on Vivian, you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So, what you said was by not pursuing that agreement, that opened the door to China's influence in the region. So, I mean, I guess for me, the Trump is awful, and all the criticism that we're making of him is absolutely true. He's gutting the environmental regulations, but these things didn't start with him. And the trade deals, for example, that have been damaging to the environment and labor have happened. I mean, Clinton drove NAFTA over the dead bodies of his allies in labor and the environment. So, so for me, the question is, I mean, I don't want to see a trade deal that privileges corporations and takes power away from Congress to make decisions which are good for the American people. So I want to see trade deals that protect the environment of our country and other countries and protect labor in here and other countries. So I just want clarification on your statement about TPP.
Vivian, you'll have 1 minute.
What I said was not that he should have stayed in TPP, but if you walk away from an agreement, you go back. He was a new president in a new administration, so he should not have abandoned the talks without continuing to try to develop a structure, because I agree certainly about the corporate issues and the ability of a corporation to sue a nation and its regulatory agencies that protect its labor and protect its environment. But you don't walk away without sitting at the table, the way he has also threatened to walk away from NATO, criticizing NATO, criticizing the UN. He doesn't want to have allies. He's a one-man show, and he thinks that he can do all the negotiations from a unilateral position. That doesn't work. You must have allies, and you must have agreements.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you both. Anybody else? Okay. So we've had covert and overt meddling in our elections. As a congressperson, how would you address these attempts to destabilize our democracy? And we start with David.
We have to take the issue of election meddling seriously, but I think, like other issues in foreign policy, we need to think about our role in the world. And we've meddled in countries all over the world and overthrown governments all over the world. So I don't mean to not answer the question, but I think we need to think very clearly about our behavior towards other countries. And the record is clear that we try to impose our will through force. And we have this massive military-industrial complex. And we're spending tons of money. And so the idea that, of course, there's going to be blowback. Of course there's going to be blowback. So many of these problems that we're discussing are really originated in the Cold War. They fall out of the Cold War, and we're still working through that lens. And so because of that, right, that our foreign of these pundits that are there that are saying Russia is the enemy, they're stuck in that Cold War framework. I know that because I've sat with people like that in my work, in my international work, that are still looking through that Cold War lens and are like, these are why we have to do these things. So, I mean, yes, election integrity is important. And what steps, investments in preventing cyber attacks and hacking, I would agree. Building up, military presence in Eastern Europe, for example, or getting involved in the internal politics in countries that are adjacent to Russia is highly problematic. And it's not surprising that Russia's like, why, what's going on? Just as if Russia or China were to get involved in the politics of our neighbors and start intervening in Canada and Mexico. So you have to look at it through a broader framework. I'm all for concrete steps to prevent cyber attacks and other forms of meddling, but if we don't look at it through a broader framework, we're not going to solve the problem.
Thank you, David. Kate.
So, it's very clear the intelligence agencies have said that Russia has meddled. And, Putin is a dictator. He does not support democracies. And so, again, this is something that we need to look to our allies, and those sanctions are not being enforced, and we need to enforce those sanctions. We need to have those investigations and make sure, find out, well, how did it happen, and who helped Russia? And the other thing that I think we need to do is certainly to invest in cyber technology. It's my son. He's a computer science kid, and and he says to me, he says, we don't do enough defense when it comes to our cyber technology. We're not doing enough in this country. We need to do more offense. And I said, well, this is something that our kids teach us a lot, is about technology. But again, we have a Russian dictator who has meddled in our elections. He needs to be held accountable. We need to enforce those sanctions. And we need to certainly work with our allies to enforce those sanctions and to work with us, because if it's not just in America, it's going to be somewhere else.
Absolutely. The question is, we've had covert and overt meddling in our elections. As a congressperson, how would you address these attempts to destabilize our democracy?
So the pillar of American democracy is confidence in our voting system. Once we lose that confidence, we no longer have a democracy. And what's going on with voter suppression is internally is already strike one against us. So having a foreign country interfere in our elections is dangerous. On top of that, all the evidence says that the Russians interfered not just to destabilize, but they interfered to help hurt Hillary Clinton and help elect Donald Trump. That may have affected the outcome of the election. I don't know that. I'm not making an accusation, but it's certainly a possibility. And that should be a real problem for every American on both parties. What concerns me most is we have a Congress right now that at least in the House of Representatives, they're doing nothing to investigate what happened. The House report that Devin Nunes put out effectively said Trump had nothing to do with it, and the Russians interfered, but didn't necessarily interfere to help Trump. So they went against our own intelligence agencies. I have a problem when the Congress of the United States goes against our own intelligence agencies. And as a congressman, my first priority is to restore Congress to doing the right thing and protecting all of the people and protecting all of our system. I'm confident we're going to have a blue wave this election, and I'm confident that we'll have a Democratic majority in the House and new leadership. And we will then look into what happened in this election and take proper steps and sanctions against the Russians, whether Mr. Trump wants to do it or not. And that's the only way we can move forward from Congress. And I think that's what's really important. Thank you.
It should be clear to any thinking person that Russia was involved in affecting the 2016 presidential election. And they are now involved in meddling with our local elections that are coming up during this off year. That's become very evident. So I don't mind accusing them of having tipped the hand during our presidential election. But we have to be very careful when we are fighting for the security of our elections, that we don't go where Trump has been trying to go, which is accusing people of voting who have no right to vote, who is demanding that the states who had been demanding, I think he now sees that it's futile, had been demanding that states provide the federal government with very sensitive private information, voter information, and the states have refused to provide that information. So we have to balance the very delicate, we have to provide the very delicate balance of protecting our right to vote, our franchise, and disenfranchising some of our citizens. But we cannot accept foreign interference in our electoral process. We cannot accept that, and we must insist that the Mueller investigation go on, that our representatives fulfill their sworn duty to defend and protect our Constitution, our way of life, and certainly our franchise. Thank you.
And Elaine, you'll finish us out.
We've all found out, haven't we, how much our system of voting depends on simple trust and goodwill. I mean, we've learned that our neighbors don't trust anymore that if they walk into a voting booth and somebody says, "That's my name," and signs the book, that it's okay if they don't pull an ID out of their pocket. We've learned this the hard way. And so we must continue to defend our voting rights as the sacred, priceless things that they are. And that really should give us pause when we're voting into how we're going to interact with a foreign nation over its voting. So in Congress, I would reestablish the Voting Rights Act. That allows the federal government to prosecute states for unfairly suppressing the vote. And it's not so hard to quantify when voter suppression and meddling have occurred. And then to address meddling from foreign nations, I'll just say that when I have been on committees to investigate allegations in my professional career, I do what you would expect a professional to do. I look at all the data, we interview who we need to interview, we write it all down, we hand our findings off to the authority who can make a decision on it. That's how I will handle intelligence in Congress. I'll handle it intelligently. Russia is a very unfriendly nation, and it's not, you don't have to look back in time and balance our Cold War against what other ill things the United States has done in other countries to figure that out. Russia is an empire in decline. It can only export the weapons it manufactures and its oil and its educated workforce, its educated people. And that makes it more dangerous even than it was years ago. That's my belief. And my belief is that when you negotiate with Russia, it's mostly sticks and no carrot, because they don't come to the table for a positive sum game. They don't believe in it. It's a zero-sum game, and they will take some of what's on the table if they're coming to the table at all.
Thank you, Elaine. Our next question is about trade, and I ask it as I have news alerts coming through on my phone. Sure, David, go ahead. Is it directed towards anybody?
I certainly don't, mean in any sense to come off as a apologist for Russia, despite my Russian last name. So I guess I'm treading on thin ice. But this issue of, to my mind, accountability begins at home, right? And so yes, Russia should be held accountable. But I would ask Kate, in terms of our democracy and the damage done to our democracy, my view is that the Iraq War was far more damaging, and there's been no accountability. There's no accountability within the party, within the Democratic Party, or in our national politics. And put alone the human cost, but so I would like to answer, do you view the Iraq War, which is more damaging to our democracy, to have, what was arguably an illegal war that went on false pretexts, and there was no accountability, there's been no accountability, or instead of pinning the failure of our democracy on what Russia may or may not have done.
Kate, 1 minute.
Okay. I think, when there's any question of what our government has done, clearly this goes back to George Bush, the decision to go to Iraq. And, I understood the need to go to Afghanistan. My husband's a 9/11 responder. We have friends who died on 9/11. And the decision of Bush to go to Iraq and to find out that there really wasn't weapons of mass destruction. Absolutely, there has to be accountability. But we're here today talking about the elections and interference in our elections. So when there is any question of any situation that's come up, certainly there should be, we should have some members of Congress who are willing to question. But right now, we have members of the House, including Lee Zeldin, who's not willing to speak up and question. He basically wants the Mueller investigation to end. So we have to have accountability for everything we do. So I don't know if I answered your question the way you wanted, but certainly in the Iraq deal, yes, there should have been investigations.
Okay, that's time for both of you. Thank
No,
you.
thanks. Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay. Our next question is about trade. And the question is, how would you characterize Trump's trade policies, and what impact will they have both nationally and on Long Island? And we start with Kate.
Well, we're looking at working with China now, with ZTE. When it comes to trade, certainly free and fair trade is important. But who's going to benefit? And I think what's important is that we have to look, when we do have trade agreements, who does benefit? Does it help our local economy? Does it help New Yorkers get back to work? Outsourcing, TPP, I believe that's where Trump has business in Vietnam, where workers are getting paid, I think, $1.60 an hour, or maybe a day. I'm not even sure exactly what that number is. However, these are the kinds of things that when we do have trade agreements, that we make sure that the standards we require here in the United States, we require the same standards elsewhere with all our trade partners. And again, when it comes to if they're not fulfilling the trade agreements, there should be consequences. And again, we have to continue to work with our allies across the world, our international allies, to make sure that these trade agreements are being enforced and being done the way they should be. Again, we have lost so many jobs. There's so many jobs that have been outsourced to other countries with low wages, and we have really not enforced our requirements. And TPP is another thing that we really will have no say when when there is any kind of human rights violations or labor issues going on as far as low wages and poor quality jobs. And we require OSHA standards. We have the NLRB, and then again, let's talk about that one, because that's something that Lee Zeldin has voted on many bills over the past year and a half that are anti-labor and really hurting workers' health and safety. And so, like again, if we do have trade agreements, we have to make sure that they're fair, and that we do ensure that everyone is doing what we do here in the United States.
So in terms of U.S. trade agreements, the one that comes to mind first is the NAFTA agreement that Clinton did with Mexico and in Canada. And it's been a boom for all of us, really. I think it's hard to say that NAFTA was not a good agreement overall. However, it's caused some problems. Some people have suffered as a result of NAFTA. Overall, we're all winners, but there's some losers out of every trade agreement in pockets that lost within the United States. So we should be doing more to help retrain people who lost as a result of these trade deals internally. And that's something that's largely missed as we go forward. It was talked about a little bit in the last presidential campaign. In terms of what Trump is doing, however, his idea is America first. He's not looking to balance winners and losers. He wants to win, and he wants to win for himself. He wants to win so he can claim a victory personally, and he wants to win, looks like, economically for himself. If you look at the ZTE deal and what were Trump's comments on ZTE and the fact that Trump Hotels just got a loan from the Chinese government, you have to wonder what's really going on in Trump's mind. So I look at that and I question Trump's objectives. When we're doing trade deals, we need to look out for labor. One of the problems in any trade deal is if we let labor get done abroad, say in China, and move U.S. labor to China, the Chinese may do it a lot more cheaply and not pay their workers as well. And they may abuse their lawyers and their laborers. And when we do that, that effectively cuts off our labor unions here. And we can't do that to American workers. We owe them more than that. So I think that's something we really need to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just repeat the question for you, Vivian. How would you characterize Trump's trade policies, and what impact will they have both nationally and on Long Island?
Thank you. Actually, using the term policy and Trump is really a contradiction in terms, because he doesn't have policies. He has no consistent policies about anything he does, and he sees everything transactionally. He sees what the next deal is going to be. So he created a dichotomy which just doesn't make sense. He has said that that China has a $500 billion advantage over the United States in trade, where I have seen charts that have made that difference between 100 billion and less than 200 billion. And how do tariffs impact our economy? Yes, there have been gluts of trade that have helped China and have helped other countries to our detriment. However, when you impose tremendous tariffs, it's kind of a game of guacamole, not guacamole, Soccer-mole. I must be getting hungry. But whack-a-mole. So he pushes China here, and then we find that China, because they have to have some kind of retribution, right? Now they're buying their soy from Brazil, hurting our farmers, or the pigs, or their pork from elsewhere, hurting, again, our farmers. Our steel costs are higher, and so, you know, the argument that went on with Campbell's soup and the can of soup and what the price of that, you have to look systemically when you're dealing with something as hard as trade, because he found that is a little harder than he thought. You can't just whack one side without expecting having a problem pop up on another side. And when he sent his first, whoops, here we go again, thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you, Elaine.
Well, I characterize President Trump's trade policies as might makes right, the same way that he tries to do foreign policy. To him, foreign policy, you have the bigger weapons, and trade policy, you have tariffs that everybody has to abide by. And that's not our golden rule. Our golden rule is I make a deal with you, you can keep the terms, I can keep the terms, and none of our people are in poverty because of the terms that we've negotiated. That's what we want for the future. And when we look at the complexity of the trade deals, we look at what we were trying to do and what really happened. Regarding the TPP, what were the upsides? The upsides are we have some control over the environmental policies of the partners. We have some control over the intellectual property and copyright protections of our partners. And the downside comes if we fail to uphold the labor protections or the environmental protections of those partners. And when we walk away from the TPP, we still get that downside of the cheaper goods because they can come from the Asian countries into Canada and Mexico and still into our borders, but we don't have any of the upsides where we have a stake in these other protections. NAFTA, if, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, there was a North American a panel convened for environmental cooperation, and there was a panel convened for labor cooperation. And those panels had symposia and white papers, and they really did try to measure how well we were doing in terms of not abandoning any of the laborers or any of the environmental concerns. And now that we've seen how globalization is seen as a pendulum swinging hard to the right with the corporations' might behind them, we know we have to work much harder than we did before on the environmental and the labor protections. But we must be in those deals and negotiate, and Trump's might makes right is a non-starter. It's a non-starter in this world.
Trump has no coherent trade policy, but the letting the genie out of the bottle that globalization creates winners and losers is not it's not untrue. The American worker has been losing ground for decades, and you know, NAFTA, I can't. That's the studies I've read. I can't see how anyone could claim that NAFTA is good for working people. It was devastating for small farmers in Mexico. It hurt auto workers here. I mean, if NAFTA was so great, I mean, why is it that the American workers have continued to lose ground in terms of their living standards? And likewise with Mexico, I mean, you have to look at the alternatives. Mexico has more poverty than it did pre-NAFTA. So I think that, yes, having trade deals that are going to be good for the United States and good for the people of the United States, not just business interests. Maybe NAFTA is viewed as a success from the business person's perspective. But so we need trade deals that are good for American people, good for the people of other nations, and good for the environment. And that's the goal. How do we get there? I mean, Trump doesn't have a clue, and that's highly problematic. But it doesn't mean that the issue of who benefits and who gains from globalization doesn't have to be addressed. The question is, how do we get there? It's not good enough just to say, oh, trade war, disaster, right? What would good trade policy look like?
Elaine.
I just decided to make a quick follow-up and address The other part of the question, when we get so excited talking about how Trump gallops over the world, we forget to talk about the impacts on Long Island. To shield us from difficulties with negotiating a trade agreement, because there are readjustments, and I hate to use the word, but winners and losers in the short term for anything that we do, we can do things to safeguard ourselves. We have to have a workforce with specialty educations and skills that's not duplicated elsewhere. We have plants in the Midwest in this country that make medical implant materials. They cannot and never will be outsourced to China or Mexico because those countries will not impose the same quality control. And these are medical implants, and we need the quality. So when we do things like that, we protect our workers, and that's what I want to do on Long Island by making sure that we expand our trade schools into directions for 21st century jobs and discoveries that we'll make.
Thank you. Perry?
Quick comment on NAFTA. NAFTA has grown the economy of the United States, of Canada, and of Mexico. There have been some workers who've been impacted negatively, but more workers have gotten jobs because these economies have grown. So I think it's hard to say that NAFTA is not a good deal, but it could be better. In terms of Trump, he does have an overall trade policy. It's called mercantilism. It's something that goes against globalism, and it's also something that, if everyone practiced, would be a disaster for the worldwide economy. Mercantilism is when you try to export more than you import, and Trump is furious about the balance of trade in the United States. But the problem is, if everybody tries to be mercantile, which we saw back from Louis XIV, then the whole world suffers. It doesn't work. Thanks.
Thank you. So as we close into the end of the debate here, in lieu of closing statements, we'd like to know from each of you, what other issue involving foreign policy that hasn't been discussed do you think requires action now? And what, in your opinion, should that action entail? And Perry, we're going to start with you.
Can you repeat the question and give me
yeah.
more time?
So the question is, what other issue involving foreign policy that has not been discussed today do you think requires action now? And what, in your opinion, should that action entail?
One thing we didn't talk about here that I think we should talk about, and it's quasi-foreign policy, and that's immigration. The United States needs to have a comprehensive immigration policy. You can start with DACA, and we need a clean DACA agreement. We need to take care of the kids who are here through no fault of their own. You can go to TPS, and people who are here seeking asylum who can't go back to their countries that they came from need to be taken care of. And we need to take care of the whole immigration system overall, to give people in the world some picture of what happens in the United States, and to give the U.S. citizens a sense of security. And once we have a real immigration policy, we need some kind of enforcement of it. Not a wall like Trump talks about, but real border security. It's the only way we're going to get a bipartisan immigration policy through. And it is a global issue. So I think that'd be my answer.
Great, thank you. Vivian?
It's really funny how close we were with that response, because I was looking at not only immigration vis-a-vis what we're facing here in the United States, but worldwide, the problem of the number of refugees, people who have been in refugee status and refugee camps, now sometimes some for over a decade. When you look at the people from Myanmar, the Rohingya who are now going to Bangladesh and beyond, 700,000 people have left Myanmar and living in horrible conditions. And yet the United States has not opened our doors to enough of those refugees, when we see that European nations have indeed opened their doors. We are the nation that has seen itself as a beacon of light. And in a world where there are so many Syrians and just people all over the world who are refugees because they could not live in the intolerable conditions in their own countries, and we have not welcomed them with open arms. And those whom we have welcomed, now we're threatening with deportation because your time is up. You've got to go back no matter what you're going back to. So we have to remember who we are, a nation that welcomes the stranger, a nation that values the humanity of every individual, a nation, and what can we do as people, as representatives in Congress? We put an awful lot of money into our military. Let's put some of that money into more of that money into humanitarian efforts throughout the world, refugee efforts, and accepting and creating programs where we could accept and integrate refugees into our own country when they have to escape intolerable situations.
So from immigration to refugees to climate refugees, we're going to continue one long group answer about what urgent problems we need to solve. I think that sometimes the most urgent problems are the ones that also will show the results the furthest out into the future and require a leap of faith. More and more of our refugees will be climate refugees, but it won't be possible for the world to embrace things that reverse climate change without the strengths of economic opportunities and the strengths of the relationships we have. And to talk in grand terms is nice, but you need a project. You need to put your attention somewhere. And so, for example, when I think about Turkey, I would urge that the United States have a policy to look at where we could be instead of where we are about to go, with more and more countries falling into preferring to be a dictatorship instead of a democracy. There were years past when Turkey wanted to be part of the European Union, and now they don't care about that. What would it take for us to make Turkey want to be in the EU, to think of themselves as, hey, in our history, it's the Silk Road. We were part of the Silk Road. We belong with the world centers of commerce. We belong with the European Union. What can we do by setting an example of economic policy that has environmental justice so that we influence more nations thinking in terms of their own economic opportunities to do what's right and to reinforce their own democracies instead of going the other way?
We need to think about our foreign policy in terms of how can we have relations with other nations based on respect and understanding of their histories, and that's the lens that we have to look it through. And we repeatedly get it wrong. As I've mentioned, I've worked in countries all over the world. I've been down deep in their politics. It's very, very hard to understand what's going on and what motivates other people in other countries. And when we make military decisions based on that, we get it wrong and we do more harm than good. So for me, the fundamental issue is how can Congress reassert itself in our foreign policy to say that we have to lead with diplomacy and respect of other countries, and we must cut the Pentagon budget. It's a runaway train. And it has horrible effects on our ability to invest in human needs here. We can all stand up here and say we're for good things. If we continue to allow the Pentagon budget and handouts to defense contractors to run away, there simply won't be the money for all the things that we care about, for investment in people, for investment in housing, in infrastructure, in food security. And so that's the lens through which we have to approach this foreign policy. That's what I want to see. And so what are those concrete steps that we can take to push back against this runaway train and this increasing Pentagon spending? It soaks up this huge percentage of the national budget. And we have to try to figure out what does it look like to have a more moral foreign policy, not one that says it's in the national interest to sell arms to Saudi Arabia to launch an immoral and vicious war on the people of Yemen that doesn't make us safe. We're getting it wrong. That's my experience. We honestly don't know what we're doing. If we don't know what we're doing, if we don't get it right country by country, then we will continue to have this runaway train. And that's what we need to do. We need to try to reset our foreign policy and have it based on morality and respect for other countries.
Thank you, David. Kate?
I think immigration is something that I don't think should be that complicated or that hard to fix. We have many law-abiding immigrants here who've been paying taxes, playing by the rules, and we need to protect them so that they can continue to stay here and do what they've been doing. You know, we have the dreamers. We need to protect them. We need to allow them to stay here. We can't send them back to where they came from. This is their home. So they deserve to stay here, and they need to work. We need to help them to work towards citizenship. And the reason why it's so important that we need to move on this as soon as possible is because this does affect our service industry. Because many of our immigrants are in the service industry, they're working on our farms, and you know we're seeing what's going on the East End with the farmers, even with the visitor visas, the worker visas. So this is something that I don't see should be so complicated. I know in the Farm Bill, there's some Republicans who wanted to put the immigration issue in there, and it got voted against by the far right. Granted, there's issues with the Farm Bill, but there is, you know, the majority of the people in the United States support the immigrants who are here and have been here a lot of years, playing by the rules, doing the right thing, and also for our dreamers. So again, I think this is something, it's not that hard to fix. It's just getting the right members in the House who will make this happen and make it move forward.
Thank you, Kate. Vivian, I know you'd like to use a card.
You know, very often as candidates at most of these forums, we've been asked, well, but what would you do as a congressperson? And much of what we've discussed today has to do with policy, and many of the issues have come up with executive orders. But we do have, as Congress, as a member of Congress, I will certainly see my power in what's the biggest policy statement of any governmental body. I learned that as a legislator for 13 years, and that's the budget. As David said, we would look at that Pentagon budget. We would look at our budget that would be deployed to help people in other countries. You know, we once saw a Europe in ruins, and we as a country stood up and had the Marshall Plan. We can help rebuild other countries without having the boots on the ground, and we can help other countries rebuild themselves, is what I should say. And so see the budget as a policy statement.
Thank you. Perry.
One thing that I think should be said before we conclude, one of the threats to the world right now is the potential death of democracy. We see authoritarian regimes springing up in formerly democratic states, and that's really scary. And you look at Trump, and he congratulated Putin for winning his election. Things like that shouldn't be happening. You have Hungary, you have Turkey, which had been democratic and are going to authoritarian governments. And if we want a future as a democracy, we need to take steps to make sure that doesn't happen. We may be under threat ourselves from this president. So going forward, we should focus on the need to preserve democracy, not just in America, worldwide, and to have an approach that takes into account human rights, which is something that Trump has taken out of the equation. Thanks.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. On behalf of myself and the Southampton Progressive Caucus, I want to thank each of you for your time, passion, and energy. Best of luck as we close towards the primary. And please remember to vote in June. Thank you, everyone.